Welcome back to the Carly Life. Today's segment will be aviation related, obviously. And if you like our channel, please hit the subscribe and like button. Leave your comments in the section below, and or email us at ralph@thecarlylife.com. Thank you. So let's dispense with Hollywood for a moment. The title of today's video is, Did the FAA Kill JFK Jr.? Well, how did this video come about? And who is it for? Well, it's for VFR pilots and students, some IFR pilots, the non-commercial passengers of general aviation aircraft, and the general public at large, who has a curiosity of this particular subject. The video will use, and I will use, some acronyms that the general public may not be familiar with, and I'll share those with you as I go along, but briefly here's some few to start with. AOPA, and that stands for Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association. It's a national group that people pay membership to belong to, and there's excellent educational programs that they offer amongst many other things for general aviation and professional pilots and aircraft owners. The other acronym would be VFR. That stands for Visual Flight Rules. The next would be IFR, Instrument Flight Rules. And those two acronyms are two sets of rules that different pilots can earn a rating under, and they can fly under different conditions. So if you're a layperson and your friend is a VFR pilot, he's not permitted to take you up under certain weather conditions, and that mostly being clouds or obscured vision to the ground, obscured within clouds, through clouds, etc. The IFR rating allows that individual to transit through clouds, fly above them, be obscured to the bottom. Doesn't mean that they always should fly in the worst of those conditions, but the rating and that training enables them to, those pilots, to do that. So that's an IFR rating. IMC. IMC stands for Instrument Meteorological Conditions. Those conditions that are defined by the FAA that requires the pilot to have an IFR rating versus a VFR rating. Steam gauges. Steam gauges are the cockpit gauges that you may be familiar with. I've seen in many Hollywood movies on cockpit views. They're round and circular. They have dials on them, and they are common in early aircraft all the way through to today, actually. And they are the traditional aircraft gauges. However, there are also some gauges now in use. It's called a glass cockpit. All contemporary airliners have them. Most commercial aviation aircraft have them that are in charter use or other commercial operations. And then there are aircraft that have both. So there are different reasons to use both, and there's different training that's required to use one or the other, and familiarity with them. Now, why did this particular video come about into my mind? Many years ago, when I completed a check ride for a certain rating, I was given that check ride by a designated examiner of the FAA. Not an FAA employee, which is most common in most ratings and check rides, is that the FAA designates an approved individual with many years of experience to check out students for certain ratings that they're applying for. And in this case, the examiner had 30,000 hours of log time as a airline captain. Now, what does that mean, 30,000 hours of log time? What does that mean to you? What does that mean to other pilots out there that are just starting out? Well, the average airline pilot flies, and I'm going to give you a conservative figure, 80 hours per month. And that's 960 hours a year. And if you flew 30,000 hours, you divide that by 960, some simple math means He had approximately 31 and a quarter years of experience behind the yoke in the airplane. And so that's a lot of time. And 30 years, if you're starting out at age 30, that only almost brings you to retirement age. Of course, you can start younger than that, but I'm just saying, 31 years is a long time and a lot of logged airline time. Now, airline pilots or commercial pilots with 30,000 hours have plenty of experience. And what does that mean? Experience counts in this business. And it's why airlines and certain types of aircraft and charter operators require a two-person crew, one senior, one junior. Experience counts. And I mention that because this examiner had that experience. And when someone has that kind of experience, my ears perk up and I listen very carefully, because that experience comes with a lot of trials and tribulations, a lot of smooth weather flying, and a lot of rough weather flying. And he certainly got my attention, where after the check ride, and I had passed that particular check ride, he had a 2.5 to 3 hour discussion with me about this particular subject, about the JFK Jr. incident. And it certainly piqued my interest. And his take on it, it's not necessarily my take, but the way he started the conversation was that when we fly, we got to get ratings and we learn to fly. They are minimum requirements defined by the FAA. They're not the maximum requirements, they're the minimum requirements. So just like as if when you first learned to drive a car, or you taught your children how to drive a car, you didn't hand them the keys and say, hey, you're leaving New York, have a nice trip to California, and by the way, you're leaving tonight, nighttime is great, and in the rain even better. So we don't conduct ourselves that way, and certainly in the aviation community, we don't want to conduct ourselves that way. So the point is that even though there are minimums that the FAA defines, and you can legally, after you get a private pilot license, rent an aircraft, get in that aircraft with passengers, provided you had the certain amount of takeoffs and landings, fly at night across the country legally. You can do this. Should you do it? No. Should you give your child the keys to the car after they get their license and tell them, enjoy that cross-country trip to California? Absolutely not. So the point is that he was suggesting that even though the FAA has minimums that enable one to get a particular credential or rating, doesn't mean you should take full advantage of what the rating offers you at that time. So they coined up the phrase, it's a license to learn. And aren't we always learning every day if we're really astute citizens? Aren't we trying to improve ourselves every day? Does the chef prepare a meal for 1,000 people when he just got out of culinary school? No. We practice, we take baby steps. So the point here is that even though the rating is been achieved, even though it comes with privileges, it doesn't necessarily mean we should exercise those privileges to the full extent that they're available to one. And this particular examiner also said there's a lot of pressure on the FAA from outside sources, such as fuel suppliers, aircraft manufacturers, training schools, the airlines themselves, to keep the training environment robust and attractive to people to want to pursue, in order that those job slots can be filled, if that's one area that the industry needs to deal with. The other is to keep the industry moving forward as far as consumption of fuel, purchasing and selling of aircraft. If the ratings are so difficult to obtain there won't be an interest in pursuing the vocation or pursuing the hobby, so to speak. And the FAA had to come up with a balance. Is it the right balance? That's not for me to judge, but with proper training and education about what the minimums are, it should give anyone who gets good training the experience necessary to render good judgment. Now, good judgment is not always easy to instill in young folks. They are, and we are all young, myself included, young people are more prone to be less risk averse. And that's because they don't have the experience. They haven't had any negative consequences. So age is a factor. What the examiner was trying to say was, yes, the FAA has some responsibility to provide a defined parameter to train individuals. Did it fail in this circumstance to set the right standards for individuals for training? He raised the question. I will provide the answer at the end of the video. And as he did as well to me, but it begged the question, does the FAA know what it's doing when it comes to providing training standards? And we had spoken at length about that, and that leads up to a host of other questions and that relate to this particular incident. The body that I mentioned about earlier, the AOPA, looked at this question very carefully for its members and for the flying public at large. And what did they have to say about it? Well, they came up with 10 items that they felt JFK Jr. failed at during this flight. Number one is a condition called get-there-itis. It is not a disease. It's a mental state of mind, a determination that above anything else, I will depart from this particular point A, and I need to and have to get to point B, despite everything else that I know. Now, what can lead one to get-there-itis? You could have certain pressures placed on yourself by outside forces that you perceive to be outside forces, but they're really yourself that makes these pressures arise. Get-there-itis. One, JFK Jr. was planning to go to a wedding that evening and had to drop a friend of his wife's off in Martha's Vineyard along the way. Now, when he had planned this trip, he had planned to leave early in the afternoon. Unfortunately, he got stuck in traffic, which many people do in the New York metropolitan, New Jersey, and Connecticut, known as the tri-state area, have on Friday afternoons or Thursday afternoons as they approach the weekend, particularly into the summertime. Traffic is a nightmare, as it is in major urban areas around that time of the day and year. So he had a two-hour delay before he even arrived at the airport. Now, everyone knows that when you get stuck in traffic, it doesn't exactly relieve stress, it causes stress. So he arrived at the airport, I'm sure a little stressed out, a little aggravated. Now it's later in the day, he'll have to be flying in evening, twilight conditions versus the daylight hours, which are better. He had this push behind him to have to make the destination by a certain time, drop off a passenger, and then still get to his final destination. And I believe the wedding he was supposed to conduct a toast there, and all expectations were high that he would attend and be there, etc. So that kind of get-there-itis, it was in his head. Now, we're going to go to alternative choices down the road in this video. Number two that the AOPA talks about is stress. Now, stress can take many forms. It could be physical stress, it can be mental and emotional stress, it can be family stress. Well, he had a combination of all of those, actually. He had an accident prior to this where he injured his left ankle, and it actually was still in a air cast. And what mental stress did he have? Well, certainly the traffic contributed to that. He had supposedly a confrontation with his then wife en route to the airport, and there was some emotional stress, and of course the family stress of his demands to be at the place at a certain time. And stress is not a condition that you want to be under when you're flying at any time. There's good stress, and this is not what we're talking about. This is bad stress to be under, where your mind can be distracted. Number three, that the AOPA talks about is time and type. How many hours did he have in that type of aircraft? How many hours is necessary to be confident flying a particular aircraft? Well, it depends on the aircraft. It depends on the individual. I will render my opinion later in the video, but the perspective from the AOPA is that he did not have enough time in that particular aircraft, in that type of aircraft. Now, that type of aircraft was a high-performance aircraft. What does that mean to the general public? It's not a jet, but it's not a two-seat Cessna, and it's not a four-seat Piper Warrior. It is a six-seat Piper with retractable landing gear, with an adjustable propeller that goes at a certain rate of speed that is requires you to be mentally ahead of the aircraft more than if you were to fly a low-performance aircraft. So more things to worry about, more things to control in a faster setting. So that's the type. Now, total time as PIC. PIC stands for Pilot in Command. He had just over a couple hundred hours as pilot in command, I believe, but the AOPA felt that his total time was insufficient for the type of aircraft and the conditions he was going to fly in. Number five is very critical: the weather. Weather plays a very important factor in any flight. You can even have, on a clear day on a commercial airliner, clear air turbulence. It's a perfectly blue sky and you can hit severe turbulence in clear air. So even though things look good, they can be deceiving, and weather is rather fickle. It changes minute by minute. Now, in the summertime on Long Island, where I live, in the late afternoon, we have radiant heat off of the ground that has been absorbed throughout the day. We have heat on the surfaces of bodies of water surrounding Long Island, that being Long Island Sound, the body of water between Long Island and Connecticut, the Atlantic Ocean. All that moisture enters the atmosphere in the late afternoon and creates a haze. Sometimes the haze combined with normal air pollutants can be so thick, it's like a soup, they call it. And when you're flying at that particular time of day, and the haze is of a severe extent, even though ground visibility is 10 miles or greater, your visibility in the air can be very low. And you cannot often distinguish the line between the sky, the horizon, and the body of water that you may be flying over or toward. And it can cause what they call spatial disorientation. And if you're not instrument rated or comfortable on the instruments, you can easily find yourself in trouble. So weather was a factor in this case. We had the hazy conditions, twilight, approaching darkness, heading into the east, which is darker than if you were to fly from the east to the west in the early evening. So his light was diminishing the further east he went. And having been up in those conditions myself and with students, it is not a game to play. So weather. Number 6, he had no instructor on board. Even though his own personal flight instructor offered to participate in the flight with him, he refused, and he had no one else in the right seat, including his wife. His wife and her companion were in the rear seat, so the right seat was empty. And that means somebody, even if they're a lay person or had minimal aviation knowledge with no rating whatsoever, can't even lend a hand to you if you need to grab something. They can't hold on to something. They can't see something out the window. They're not looking for you. So there was no assistance whatsoever from anyone on board, and no right seat passenger. That was number 7. Number 8, he had no radio contact after departing the home base airport out of New Jersey. And what does that mean? Well, as a private pilot, he's not mandated to contact the FAA for any services after he departs, unlike commercial pilots. So he had no radio contact after departure, no flight following, which is a service the FAA provides for free to all pilots, and you can elect to use it, and I do. But he chose not to do that. And what they do is they track your flight in the entire length if they have time available to do that for you. And on board his aircraft, it was a fully certified IFR aircraft that could fly under instrument conditions, although he was not rated for that. It did have an autopilot. And an autopilot can certainly ease a lot of stress and take the workload off of you. You just have to engage it. Even if it's momentary, if you're spatially disoriented, you can put it on autopilot to get your bearing a little bit, give you time to settle down mentally, get your stress level to where it should be, and make any adjustments. Contact the FAA, tell them where you're at, what your problem is, confess, make a 180, go back home. The autopilot it can be your friend at times. So he did not choose to use the autopilot. And number 10, he didn't alter his plan, any plan en route based upon weather, his disorientation, etc. He did not return to the departing airport. That was an option. He could have chosen that. He could have chosen many airports along his route to divert to if he felt uncomfortable. I believe there are 57 to 59 airports that within 10 miles of his planned route that he could have easily reached and made a landing at. He didn't consider any other options but flying himself and his companions and his wife to the destination. What other options did he have? Certainly he had the means to fly commercially. He could have taken a flight up to Boston or somewhere in Rhode Island and taken a quick commuter hop over to Martha's Vineyard. That's certainly within his realm of possibilities. Maybe not at the same time frame, but it was an option. He could have driven there. It would have taken longer, yes, but the drive is doable, certainly within 6 to 8 to 10 hours. He could have had a driver drive him, and certainly he had the means to charter a flight out of New Jersey, out of Teterboro. Many charter flights available, and certainly able to get in and out of the destinations that he was going to, and he certainly had the means to be able to pay for a flight like that. So he chose to bear it all himself on his shoulders and embark on his own. And look at the consequences. So all of these elements from the AOPA's point of view culminate into what they call, like in nautical terms, the perfect storm. He created his own storm. Now, let me give you my Captain Ralph's always attitudes, kind of like the Beatitudes of the Bible, but for aviation. And these are things that if you listen to them, consider them, they're not all of them that are out there. There are other instructors and aviation professionals that will contribute to this, I'm sure, and put their 2 cents in. And I certainly encourage that and don't object to it, because I always consider every day that I wake up a learning exercise, be it on the ground or in the air. So, one, a license to learn, that's the coined phrase. What does that mean? For early or relatively minted new VFR pilots, you don't exercise the privilege to its fullest extent. Start with baby steps. Encourage yourself not to go too far out of a comfort zone that you're used to. Start with your early flights, 5 miles around the airport, then extend it to 10 miles, then to 25 miles, 50 miles. At 100 miles, that's the only time I would feel comfortable encouraging a student to begin taking passengers. 100 miles with 100 hours of experience behind it. So before you start taking passengers, think about how much time you have and how comfortable do you feel putting other people in your responsibility zone. So one of mine is take baby steps, move your circle of aviation destinations within the range that I just mentioned. Number 2, don't take passengers until you've attained 100 hours of flight time as pilot in command. You need to be more comfortable with the aircraft. You need to understand its systems, and you need to be able to manage all of the systems of the aircraft that will not jeopardize your passengers. So my always attitude about that is always take passengers after you've achieved 100 hours of experience. Number 3, this probably could be number 1, but in aviation, always check your ego at the door. The best pilots, I would say 99.9% of all airline personnel, pilots, first officers, are very proud of what they do. However, they are not egomaniacs. They are reserved and humble persons. And that's the attitude you need to adopt. Humility is your friend. It has no room for know-it-alls. And humility will keep you safe. Number 4, be respectful to the FAA, weather briefers, and when they state VFR not recommended, heed their advice. Do not fly to that destination or your departure airport if that's what the weather conditions are. You're taking your life into your own hands. As this examiner told me, when you talk to students about this particular issue, you can coin it this way. If you're newly minted, it's like giving someone a revolver with 5 bullets in the chamber. And you decide which one is empty that day. If you don't heed this advice, is that what you want to do? You want to play Russian roulette with your life and the lives of others? So, no. When you're speaking to aviation professionals from the FAA, whether you're reading knowledge in the FAR AIM and the rule books, whether you're listening to weather briefers, understand that all that information, all those people and personnel that put that information together for you are your friends. They're not your enemy. You're not going to beat Mother Nature, and you're not going to beat the FAA. Number 6, know your emergency procedures for your aircraft you're flying by heart. And I recommend and use the blindfold exercise. and you'll need an assistant for this. Um, Put an actual handkerchief over your eyes. Sit at a table. Have your spouse, best friend, significant other have your emergency checklist in hand. You sit there, have them read off the emergencies, and then you read the checklist procedures back to them. They affirm that you've read the right checklist in the right order. At the same time, motion as if you had the instrument panel in front of you, and motion to the things that you're going to do per the checklist. You need to do that over and over again, blindfolded, until it's ingrained in your memory, where it becomes your second nature, where you don't have to think about it, where you don't have to refer to a checklist, which can fall between your seat and the chair and the flaps, or can fall behind you, or if you're thinking of fumbling around in an emergency for the pilot's operating handbook, that's not the time to look for it. This emergency procedures should become your best friend, and the knowledge of them like your wife, spouse, significant other is. So that's my recommendation regarding emergency procedures. Now, another thing on emergency procedures, use a simulator. Check this out. How far can you glide at different altitudes in the event of a loss of power emergency? Have you ever tried that? I've done this with people I've flown with. From Connecticut, how high do I need to be on a particular day, particular weather conditions, particular wind, to make the Long Island shoreline? How high do I need to be to make an airport? These are exercises that the simulator is great for, and you should understand how to obtain best glide ratio like the back of your hand, and make it safely to an emergency landing spot, be it a field, a beach, an open road without power lines, an airport. Just talking about it and doing, passing it on the written exam and doing one example of it in flight is not enough for you to gain experience as to what is your best glide ratio in that particular one if scenario. So I do recommend using the simulator and practicing at various altitudes, because you'll be surprised how far you can and or cannot go, and it will open your eyes to the coined phrase that altitude is your friend. The higher you go, the better your chances are of survival of an in-flight power off emergency. It gives you time for gliding. It gives you distance. You have many more options than if you're closer to the ground. So practice that when you are at home on a rainy day and you can't fly, and you sit at that simulator. Give it a try. These are little experiments you can play with that are very helpful in enlightening your mind to altitude being your friend. Number 7, if you're a VFR rated pilot, do not fly at night until you have obtained a minimum of 500 hours in the class and type of aircraft, or get your IFR rating. While at night flying is beautiful, air is still, visibility often is beautiful at night. If you live even on Long Island, there's several bodies of water surrounding us. At night, you cannot distinguish an open body of water from an open field. You don't know where power lines are. If you're over big expanses of big tracts of land, you don't know what's below you. Terrain does not distinguish itself on a moonless night. And you don't know if it's rugged, if it's smooth, if it's a field, if there are obstacles down below. So VFR pilots, don't fly at night unless you have 500 hours of experience and or get an IFR rating. Number 8, do not fly over bodies of water over 10 miles without an approved flotation device. Number 9, altitude is your friend again. Don't showboat. Flying around at 500 feet above the shoreline, don't buzz your friend's house or farm. Don't scud run. Now, what does that mean, scud run? That means flying below a very low ceiling layer of clouds between several hundred feet just to get to a destination. And you may be flying illegally over for FAA minimums. You may be flying illegally because you're going over obstacles, people, structures that you're not supposed to be flying over at that low of an altitude. Don't get yourself in a situation and do not scud run. And that goes back to buzzing a friend's house. Do not do like they show in the old movies. This is not Hollywood. Do not fly so low to the ground that you actually can make someone's china vibrate in their china cabinet. It's not legal. Don't try to show off that way. It's not necessary. Just be proud enough you have a rating. Number 10, unless flying in the airport traffic pattern, always file a flight plan. It's free. Not much is free in this country anymore, but the flight plan that you file is free, and it provides a host of services that will protect you in the event of an incident. By the way, make sure you close your flight plan at landing. Now, what is a flight plan for those people who are lay people? It's a plan that you can file and should file with the FAA that talks about how many people are on board, what's the fuel, how many, what's your route, how long is your time estimated to get there, things of that nature, and anticipated arrival time. So the FAA has that on record, and if they expect to see you or hear from you closing that plan by a certain time, they're going to reach out to you either by text, phone, or on the radio. Mr. So-and-so, Mrs. So-and-so, did you arrive there safely? Oh yes, I just forgot to close my flight plan. If you don't do that, of course, they're going to send out a search and rescue for you, and that's costly. So remember to close out your flight plan. Always use the approved checklist for your aircraft. Always. I don't care what kind of quality memory you have. If you put those stress elements back into the equation, you may forget something on your checklist. We're all human. Use it. It's required. Use the checklist. Professional pilots who fly every day in the airlines, use a checklist. Don't be embarrassed to have a checklist in front of your passengers. It's there for a reason. It's required. So use your checklist. Always get a weather briefing. Always for your flight the day prior, the day of, and 15 minutes prior to departure. It's fickle. Weather changes by the minute. And another freebie, weather briefings are free. Yes, that's right. It's a simple phone call. You can do it online if you don't like to talk to people. You can do it on the phone even if you don't like to talk to people, but it's free. Now, why do I suggest getting at those 3 different intervals? One, you get the big picture the day before. You're honing in onto a macro situation the day of. Now, I have many times returned from a proposed flight because the weather changed while I was on the taxiway waiting for my clearance for departure. Particularly prominent in the summertime in Long Island, we have pop-up thunderstorms. We have squall lines that come through that are not on the weather, that were not reported, and they can come up like that, and they can bite you badly. So I've turned around many times, gone back to the ramp, tied the aircraft down, and these pass quickly. Let it pass, let the system go by, get back in, start all over, so you delayed an hour or two. It's better that way than to be in the path of something like a squall line, which could basically tear the winds off your aircraft, small aircraft. So get your weather briefings always a day before, a day of, and 15 minutes prior to departure. They're free, again. Always carry an extra quart of oil on board if you're flying in a small aircraft. Sometimes you'll land at a destination airport, you need to refuel and you realize, oh, I'm short a quart of oil. You check your oil again and there are no services available. So you don't want to fly with low oil. Low oil will cause many problems on the engine, and you don't want to have a mechanical failure that's your fault, not someone else's. So carry an extra quart of oil. Number 14, always perform a complete pre-flight per your approved checklist and visually confirm fuel quantity and quality. Number 14, always perform a complete pre-flight per your approved checklist. Do not take shortcuts. Do not skip the pre-flight. Even if you went into the restroom, you just landed, and you're coming back out to go onto the second leg of your flight, pre-flight the airplane. I have seen people go to the restroom and a plane came by and just nicked one of their wingtips, causing it to have a condition that could be marginal, not flyable, or not airworthy. So you never know what can happen when you're away from the aircraft, even for 15 minutes. So always do a complete pre-flight per your checklist. And the most important thing on the pre-flight for me, confirm the quality of your fuel, confirm the quantity in all tanks. The quantity necessary to make your destination and the required reserves per the FAA. Number 15, always be prepared for an FAA ramp check. It's happened to me on more than one occasion, particularly more often since 9/11. Have your proper documents on your possession. Verify the ARROW documents are in the aircraft. Not only are they in the aircraft, but that they need to be current. So ARROW documents are airworthiness certificate, registration, etc., owner's operating handbook, weight and balance sheet. These are weight and balance sheets. These are things that the aircraft owner has to have on board at all times. Now, why do I say make sure they're current, particularly if you're renting aircraft or while training? Oftentimes I've seen this at flight schools where the flight schools allow the students to take the pilot operating handbook out of the aircraft and make copies of it. And they take it home overnight, and if you forgot it at home, the airplane's out for rent. Somebody goes in there and inadvertently does not verify the aircraft documents, gets a RAM check, there's no POH in the aircraft. Wow, that's a pretty big ding. So don't let that happen to you. So what I do is I have a copy of a POH for every aircraft that I fly in my personal possession, and they're not that expensive to obtain. You should do the same, because you will find a situation where you'll go into an aircraft that you're renting or using and the POH is missing. So make sure you have one. And the other thing regarding renting and or using aircraft that are flying, make sure that the registration of the aircraft is current and not expired. If there was a time when I had just gotten one of my early ratings, and I had purchased block time for personal excursions, and I had planned a trip with my family, or one day overnight somewhere, and using that block time, went to the airport, was going through the documents, and discovered that the registration was expired. Now, get there-itis would say, nobody's going to notice, right? Well, I'm not the type of individual, nor was I trained that way, to blow off that requirement. So packed everyone back in the car, we went home. I had a long conversation with the owner of the aircraft, that how could he be renting out aircraft with expired registrations, and I got my money back, and I moved on to other things and other places. But that can happen to you. Had I gotten RAM checked and was attempting to fly that aircraft with an expired registration, I'd be in big trouble. The owner would be as well, but pilot in command puts that burden of responsibility on you to verify. If you fly an aircraft that's not airworthy, it does not have the proper registration, it's your problem. So pay attention to those documents, make sure they're current, make sure they're in the aircraft. The other thing, number 16, make sure that the minimum required instruments in that aircraft for that type of flight are fully functional. Again, this can lead to a RAM check incident. I have never had a negative incident on a RAM check. They've always been very positive. I've done what I was supposed to do. I was trained properly, and I abide by the rules. So some people will fly without a landing light. They think they're going to be flying in daylight hours. Well, okay. What about if sky conditions change? And irrespective of that, put your landing light on in the traffic pattern. It makes you easier to see. So it wasn't required for that particular type of flight, but you take chances. Why not improve your chances instead of reduce your chances? So make sure all the minimum instruments are fully operational. And number 17, always report aircraft squawks to the owner or your mechanic. What is a squawk to the layperson? It's a deficiency in some element of the aircraft, an instrument, a mechanical element, something on the skin of the aircraft, any of those things. They must be reported. I see this in renters. They fail to report them. They forget. They don't think it's important. Meanwhile, the next person gets in the aircraft. The deficiency exists. They may not be paying attention to it, may not know it exists, and it can be problematic for that particular flight. So always report the squawks to the owner and or your mechanic upon their discovery. Number 18, always have a sterile cockpit from engine start through departing the traffic pattern, when in the pattern, on approach, when entering or transitioning through class Bravo, B, class Charlie, C, class Delta, D, airspace, when flying above or under the shelf areas of those airspaces. Now, to the layperson, what the sterile cockpit means, it means silence of the passengers communicating with the pilot in command. Be quiet, let him concentrate. Those are the critical times of the flight where he needs to pay attention to what he's doing or she's doing and listen to any communications with air traffic control with very due diligence. Number 19, always carry a portable transceiver. Now, what does that look like to those people or newly minted pilots? If you haven't seen one, it's a handheld device that you can communicate with air traffic control, program your frequencies in advance into it, and this one also has some of my aircraft instruments built into it as well as navigational instruments. Very good for a backup pair of suspenders, and it's a very cheap insurance policy. So I always carry a transceiver on board with charged batteries. Most important, make sure you have your headset adapter connected to it. Don't be fumbling when you have a loss of communication and try to plug your headset into the handheld transceiver and the adapter is not there. For those of you who have not experienced this, have only flown with headsets, in a small aircraft, if the headset is not functioning, or if you have to transmit through this manually through the mic, the press-to-talk microphone, and you can't use your headsets, it's rather loud, and it could be so loud that you cannot hear communications too well. So I love the headsets. We've got all kinds out there. A headset connected to this works just as well as the headset communicating through your onboard radios. So cheap pair of suspenders, very inexpensive insurance, and I highly recommend it. Many brands out there. Next is always remain ahead of the aircraft. If this hasn't been beaten into your head by your instructor throughout the course of your training, it is one of the most critical elements of flying safely. The idea is you're no longer a passenger who's sightseeing. You're the pilot in command, and that bears a lot of responsibility on you to be ahead of the aircraft in what if, what should I, what can I do. Now, in small light aircraft with 100 horsepower engines, being 20 miles ahead of the aircraft in your thought process is probably adequate. The more the horsepower, the more complex the aircraft, the more ahead of the aircraft you have to remain in your thought processes. So try to practice that concept on a simulator and see how you can apply them when you actually get into the aircraft. Number 21, if you're a VFR pilot, have your head on a swivel at all times. 80% of the time should be checking outside of the aircraft, 20% on the instruments. Looking for traffic, scanning properly for traffic, particularly over or near designated reporting checkpoints. There's one right near where I live, Northport Stacks. It's a great reporting point. The stacks are the second highest smokestacks in the United States. It's a very visual observable landmark from land and from the air. So you'll see a lot of planes converging there, particularly on a weekend when you have general aviation flyers going either training or on sightseeing flights or whatever, near that checkpoint. So be careful over checkpoints. I don't recommend flying directly over them. It could be a point of possible mid-air collision where everyone's converging on that point and thinking about where they need to go, be reporting to next. It can be very congested at times, at certain times of the day, and particularly on the weekends. So be very cognizant of your situational awareness at and around observable reporting checkpoints, particular popular ones. And also have your head at a swivel when approaching and entering the traffic pattern, when departing the traffic pattern, and pay attention particularly at uncontrolled airports. I've been at uncontrolled airports where people have not reported radio positioning, approaching the airport, overflying it within the pattern. So doesn't mean because the rules exist and that everyone will abide by them. So have your head on a swivel, as I was taught, and be aware. Now, if you have a passenger with you who is cooperative, make them do some look and see as well. See and avoid is a very normal practice in light aviation VFR flying. It's not meant to scare anyone, but it's meant to keep you safe. So if you have an extra set of eyes there and they're willing to cooperate, by all means use them. And they don't need to get all hysterical if they see an airplane. They just point it, give you a tap on the shoulder, advise you where it is so that you're aware of where the traffic is. Always do your minimum currency requirements at different airports for takeoffs and landings, for carrying passengers. Don't just do touch and goes and to a stop at your home base airport just to satisfy the minimum requirements. That's anyone can do that and satisfy a requirement. We're not talking about getting away with the minimums here. We want to be better pilots. So do those practice maneuvers and requirements to stay current at different airports and even some that you have not flown to before. If you're flying to satisfy your IFR currency, confirm that your safety check pilot is current and rated in the same class and type of aircraft you're flying. Very critical if you're under the foggles or the obscuration device. Make sure that that person can take over pilot and command control of the aircraft and that he's legally allowed to do so. So confirm that your safety pilot is qualified and rated and current for you to do your safety, your currency requirements for IFR. The same will apply to IFR. Do your practice approaches and departures at different airports. And don't just do it at a home base airport to go through the motions and get the currency legally qualified. If you're a newly minted pilot, do not switch aircraft that you've been trained in for at least 500 hours in that type of aircraft. If only flying on steam gauges, remain on steam gauges. If you were trained on a glass cockpit, stay with the glass cockpit for 500 hours till you're thoroughly familiar with all the features and systems of that aircraft. Then you can go trying different aircraft for rent, for use. Do I want to go high wing? Do I go low wing? Do I want to fly with a glass cockpit? Do I want to just stay with steam gauges? But get 500 hours of experience in the aircraft that you've been trained in first. Always carry paper charts with you. Now, why do I say that? We have wonderful technology today, that aids a pilot in a cockpit, and technology is not fail-proof. This is fail-safe and works every time, provided you don't open your window when they fly out. So carry a current set of charts with you in the event that something should malfunction on some of your current devices, these wonderful tablets, the GPS screens, etc., that may be on board or may be portable. And it's always great to have an extra pair of suspenders. Again, these are cheap. Make sure they're current. Same goes with your airport facility directory. Have one on board with you. I carry mine all the time. And it's also good to review with passengers who haven't flown before the flight. Open a map out. They can relate to a map. They may not be able to relate to your for-flight device or for-flight software, but certainly a map everyone is relatable to. And I encourage that when bring new passengers on board who've never flown before. Also carry a spare flashlight with you, particularly if you're flying at night, and get one that can project not only white light, like so, but red light, because your red light is good for eye acclimation at night when looking at charts in particular. And should your lights fail in the airplane, it's happened to me, so it's nice to have a pair of lights on board that will work for you. And I recommend a spare flashlight, as well as a spare set of pencils and pens with you. The item number 26, always have an alternate airport available along your route, and or have an alternate emergency landing area. And this goes back again to staying out of the aircraft. And emergency landings are stressful, particularly at night. You don't know what the terrain is like below you. You don't know if there are power lines there. You don't know if there are radio tower guy wires projecting out sometimes 1,000, 1,500 feet from the tower itself. And bodies of water at night, they can look like tracts of land. So have your alternates planned before you depart. Number 27, if IFR rated, remain current. Don't just rely on the simulated time. As the old song goes, ain't nothing like the real thing, baby. And yes, simulators are good. They're excellent tools, and they're good for practicing procedures. But real flying is better. And real flying in actual IMC with a qualified pilot with you as your safety pilot, even better, or instructor. So number 28, instructors should take students up in minimal visibility days. I mean VFR pilots who are just starting out. If you're an instructor and you live in a fair weather climate, find some bad weather to take your students up into. Let them see what 3 miles visibility is. Let them see what 3 miles with clouds is, what 6 miles of visibility in haze is, what the 6 or 10 miles visibility look like at different altitudes. Take a drive with them in a car. Know a landmark that's 6 miles or 10 miles away. Give them a sense on the ground what visibility looks like. Can they see that tower that's 6 miles away off the interstate or 10 miles away? Give them a sense of what the real world is, not just what it appears like on a simulator or fair weather days. Again, anyone can do that. Let's be great pilots, not just average pilots. So take your students up under different weather conditions. When you fly west at sunset in the summertime, what's that like? Maybe this is the first time the student has got his ticket, he's going to take a flight, and he's going to rent an aircraft, and he's going to fly from Block Island to Montauk. The sun is setting low on the horizon, hazy in the summertime. Man, I tell you, you cannot even, so the sun is so blinding, you cannot even see the boundary of the runway. You cannot even sometimes see the approach to the runway. The sun is so blinding. Even with the rosin visors, even with sunglasses. And while we're speaking of sunglasses, for you that love to wear aviators like I do, if you're flying with a glass cockpit, make sure you do not have polarized lenses. Polarized lenses will make all of those nice glass cockpit features become dark black. So just get the regular prescription that you use, or regular sunglasses that are not polarized. Okay, back to minimum visibility days, taking students up. What is flying east on sunrise like? What is it like to fly in the rain? Which VFR students can do if the cloud layer is at a certain altitude and it's raining. Same with snow. Give the student actual conditions whenever possible, not to encourage them to fly in those conditions, but to encourage them to show the hazards of what it would be to fly in those conditions. So it's a great teaching tool, nothing like Mother Nature. Also, take them up in light chop and moderate turbulence. What does moderate turbulence feel like in a Cessna 150? Well, I can tell you, if you've ever done that, you're going to have a bump on the top of your head. Moderate turbulence will take you out of the seat and your head will hit the top of the aircraft fuselage interior cabin, leaving you with a nice little bump. So do you want to, when you get your ticket, take passengers up under those conditions? If you know that moderate or turbulence or a light chop is prevalent during your flight, is that something that's going to encourage people to want to come back and fly with you? Nonetheless, it's one of those stress items. A light chop over long duration can contribute to body stress. So make your students aware of what those real life conditions are. You cannot duplicate that on a simulator. Even a great full motion simulator on the ground cannot compete with Mother Nature. So please I encourage all instructors to take students up, even VFR students, in real life conditions. Number 29, be proud to be a pilot, while at the same time understand that humility will keep you safe and make you a better pilot. Number 30, don't let your lack of planning become someone else's crisis. And as a passenger, don't let that person that you're going to fly with's lack of planning become your crisis and your disaster. As a pilot in command, you have a responsibility to yourself, your passengers, and the people on the ground. It's not about you. It's not about me. It's about everyone. You're only going to hurt aviation at large if you don't observe these. And you dash any hopes of people who are considering pursuing aviation pursuits, whether as a career or as a nice hobby or activity, if your actions create fear. 31, you can have an exciting, robust, and fulfilling aviation adventure even while adhering to these above always attitudes. Your friends, family members, fellow aviators will appreciate your respect for the privilege that you have. So at the end of this video, I mentioned how we would assess the title. We're coming to that briefly. Today we live in a culture of responsibility deflection. It's endemic in our leaders, the media, professional athletes, caregivers, educators, professionals of every field, our neighbors, friends, and children. It's your responsibility to take personal responsibility for all of your actions and decisions. Aviation is not very forgiving for the responsibility deflectors. Make sure you're not one of them. My parents came over here from Europe post-World War II, God rest their souls, from dictatorship environments. They had such an appreciation for the freedoms of this country, but they did tell me and instill in me this idea, which I would suggest to you. We have many freedoms in this country, and with freedom comes an extremely high level of responsibility on when and how to exercise those freedoms. So, to circle back to the question, did the FAA kill JFK Jr.? No. Personal responsibility is what this video is about. It's hard to teach it if you haven't been brought up that way. Well, listening to this may give you a second chance at revisiting the notion to become a more personally responsible pilot, but for the sake of the safety of yourself, your passengers, folks on the ground, and for the enjoyment that this privilege and this freedom affords us in this country. God bless you, and God bless the USA. Thank you for listening to me. Thank you for visiting our channel. If you like the topic, you like the subjects, there'll be more aviation videos on our channel, as well as other topics of interest to you. Thank you, and have a blessed day.